Section 31 of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rome by Émile ZOLA, translated by Ernest VIZETELLY. Chapter 16, Part 1. On the following day, on his return from the funeral, Pierre lunched alone in his room, having decided to take leave of the Cardinal and Donna Serafina during the afternoon. He was quitting Rome that evening by the train which started at 17 minutes past 10. There was nothing to detain him any longer. There was only one visit which he desired to make, a visit to old Orlando, with whom he had promised to have a long chat prior to his departure. And so a little before 2 o'clock he sent for a cab which took him to the Via 20 Settembre. A fine rain had fallen all night, its moisture steeping the city in grey vapour, and though this rain had now ceased, the sky remained very dark, and the huge new mansions of the Via 20 Settembre were quite livid, interminably mournful, with their balconies ever of the same pattern and their regular and endless rows of windows. The Ministry of Finances, that colossal pile of masonry and sculpture, looked in particular like a dead town, a huge bloodless body whence all life had withdrawn. On the other hand, although all was so gloomy, the rain had made the atmosphere milder. In fact, it was almost warm, damply and feverishly warm. In the hall of Prada's little palazzo, Pierre was surprised to find 4 or 5 gentlemen taking off their overcoats. However, he learnt from a servant that Count Luigi had a meeting that day with some contractors. As he, Pierre, wished to see the Count's father, he had only to ascend to the 3rd floor, added the servant. He must knock at the little door on the right-hand side of the landing there. On the very first landing, however, the priest found himself face to face with the young Count, who was there receiving the contractors, and who, on recognizing him, became frightfully pale. They had not met since the tragedy at the Boccanera mansion, and Pierre well realized how greatly his glance disturbed that man, what a troublesome recollection of moral complicity it evoked, and what mortal dread lest he should have guessed the truth. "Have you come to see me? Have you something to tell me?" the Count inquired. "No, I am leaving Rome. I have come to wish your father good-bye." Prada's pallor increased at this, and his whole face quivered. "Ah, it is to see my father. He is not very well, be gentle with him," he replied. And as he spoke, his look of anguish clearly proclaimed what he feared from Pierre, some imprudent word, perhaps even a final mission, the malediction of that man and woman whom he had killed. And surely, if his father knew, he would die as well. "Ah, how annoying it is," he resumed. "I can't go up with you. There are gentlemen waiting for me. Yes, how annoyed I am. As soon as possible, however, I will join you. Yes, as soon as possible." He knew not how to stop the young priest, whom he must evidently allow to remain with his father, whilst he himself stayed down below, kept there by his pecuniary worries. But how distressful were the eyes with which he watched Pierre climb the stairs, how he seemed to supplicate him with his whole quivering form. His father, good Lord, the only true love, the one great, pure, faithful passion of his life. "Don't make him talk too much. Brighten him, won't you?" were his parting words. Up above, it was not Battista, the devoted ex-soldier, who opened the door, but a very young fellow to whom Pierre did not at first pay any attention. The little room was bare and light as on previous occasions, and from the broad curtainless window there was the superb view of Rome, Rome crushed that day beneath a leaden sky and steeped in shade of infinite mournfulness. Old Orlando, however, had in no wise changed, but still displayed the superb head of an old blanched lion, a powerful muzzle and youthful eyes, which yet sparkled with the passions which had growled in a soul of fire. Pierre found the stricken hero in the same armchair as previously, near the same table littered with newspapers, and with his legs buried in the same black wrapper, as if he were there immobilized in a sheath of stone, to such a point that after months and years one was sure to perceive him quite unchanged, with living bust, and face glowing with strength and intelligence. That grey day, however, he seemed gloomy, low in spirits. "Ah, so here you are, my dear Monsieur Froment," he exclaimed. "I have been thinking of you these 3 days past, living the awful days which you must have lived in that tragic Palazzo Boccanera. Ah, God, what a frightful bereavement! My heart is quite overwhelmed. These newspapers have again just upset me with the fresh details they give." He pointed as he spoke to the papers scattered over the table. Then with a gesture he strove to brush aside the gloomy story, and banish that vision of Benedetta dead, which had been haunting him. "Well, and yourself?" he inquired. "I am leaving this evening," replied Pierre, "but I did not wish to quit Rome without pressing your brave hands." "You are leaving? But your book?" "My book? I have been received by the Holy Father. I have made my submission and reprobated my book." Orlando looked fixedly at the priest. There was a short interval of silence, during which their eyes told one another all that they had to tell respecting the affair. Neither felt the necessity of any longer explanation. The old man merely spoke these concluding words: "You have done well, your book was a chimera." "Yes, a chimera, a piece of childishness, and I have condemned it myself in the name of truth and reason." A smile appeared on the dolorous lips of the impotent hero. "Then you have seen things, you understand and know them now." "Yes, I know them, and that is why I did not wish to go off without having that frank conversation with you which we agreed upon." Orlando was delighted, but all at once he seemed to remember the young fellow who had opened the door to Pierre, and who had afterwards modestly resumed his seat on a chair near the window. This young fellow was a youth of 20, still beardless, of a blonde handsomeness such as occasionally flowers at Naples, with long curly hair, a lily-like complexion, a rosy mouth, and soft eyes full of a dreamy languor. The old man presented him in fatherly fashion. Angiolo Mascara his name was, and he was the grandson of an old comrade in arms, the epic Mascara of the 1,000, who had died like a hero, his body pierced by 100 wounds. "I sent for him to scold him," continued Orlando with a smile. "Do you know that this fine fellow with his girlish airs goes in for the new ideas? He is an anarchist, one of the 3 or 4 dozen anarchists that we have in Italy. He is a good little lad at bottom. He has only his mother left him, and supports her, thanks to the little berth which he holds, but which he'll lose one of these fine days if he is not careful. Come, come, my child, you must promise me to be reasonable." Thereupon Angiolo, whose clean but well-worn garments bespoke decent poverty, made answer in a grave and musical voice: "I am reasonable. It is the others, all the others, who are not. When all men are reasonable and desire truth and justice, the world will be happy." "Ah, if you fancy that he'll give way," cried Orlando. "But, my poor child, just ask Monsieur l'Abbé if one ever knows where truth and justice are. Well, well, one must leave you the time to live, and see and understand things." Then, paying no more attention to the young man, he returned to Pierre, while Angiolo, remaining very quiet in his corner, kept his eyes ardently fixed on them, and with open quivering ears lost not a word they said. "I told you, my dear Monsieur Froment," resumed Orlando, "that your ideas would change, and that acquaintance with Rome would bring you to accurate views far more readily than any fine speeches I could make to you. So I never doubted but what you would of your own free will withdraw your book as soon as men and things should have enlightened you respecting the Vatican at the present day. But let us leave the Vatican on one side. There is nothing to be done but to let it continue falling slowly and inevitably into ruin. What interests me is our Italian Rome, which you treated as an element to be neglected, but which you have now seen and studied, so that we can both speak of it with the necessary knowledge." He thereupon at once granted a great many things, acknowledged that blunders had been committed, that the finances were in a deplorable state, and that there were serious difficulties of all kinds. They, the Italians, had sinned by excess of legitimate pride. They had proceeded too hastily with their attempt to improvise a great nation, to change ancient Rome into a great modern capital as by the mere touch of a wand. And thence had come that mania for erecting new districts, that mad speculation in land and shares, which had brought the country within a hair's breadth of bankruptcy. At this Pierre gently interrupted him to tell him of the view which he himself had arrived at after his peregrinations and studies through Rome. "That fever of the first hour, that financial debacle," he said, "is after all nothing. All pecuniary sores can be healed. But the grave point is that your Italy still remains to be created. There is no aristocracy left, and as yet there is no people, nothing but a devouring middle class, dating from yesterday, which preys on the rich harvest of the future before it is ripe." Silence fell. Orlando sadly wagged his old leonine head. The cutting harshness of Pierre's formula struck him in the heart. "Yes, yes," he said at last, "that is so. You have seen things plainly. And why say no when facts are there, patent to everybody? I myself have already spoken to you of that middle class which hungers so ravenously for place and office, distinctions and plumes, and which at the same time is so avaricious, so suspicious with regard to its money which it invests in banks, never risking it in agriculture or manufactures or commerce, having indeed the one desire to enjoy life without doing anything, and so unintelligent that it cannot see it is killing its country by its loathing for labour, its contempt for the poor, its one ambition to live in a petty way with the barren glory of belonging to some official administration. And, as you say, the aristocracy is dying, discrowned, ruined, sunk into the degeneracy which overtakes races towards their close, most of its members reduced to beggary, the others, the few who have clung to their money, crushed by heavy imposts, possessing naught but dead fortunes which constant sharing diminishes, and which must soon disappear with the princes themselves. And then there is the people, which has suffered so much and suffers still, but is so used to suffering that it can seemingly conceive no idea of emerging from it, blind and deaf as it is, almost regretting its ancient bondage, and so ignorant, so abominably ignorant, which is the one cause of its hopeless, moralless misery. For it has not even the consolation of understanding that if we have conquered and are trying to resuscitate Rome and Italy in their ancient glory, it is for itself, the people, alone. Yes, yes, no aristocracy left, no people as yet, and a middle class which really alarms one. How can one therefore help yielding at times to the terrors of the pessimists, who pretend that our misfortunes are as yet nothing, that we are going forward to yet more awful catastrophes, as though, indeed, what we now behold were but the first symptoms of our race's end, the premonitory signs of final annihilation? As he spoke, he raised his long quivering arms towards the window, towards the light, and Pierre, deeply moved, remembered how Cardinal Boccanera on the previous day had made a similar gesture of suppliant distress when appealing to the divine power. And both men, cardinal and patriot, so hostile in their beliefs, were instinct with the same fierce and despairing grandeur. "As I told you, however, on the first day," continued Orlando, "we only sought to accomplish logical and inevitable things. As for Rome, with her past history of splendour and domination which weighs so heavily upon us, we could not do otherwise than take her for capital, for she alone was the bond, the living symbol of our unity at the same time as the promise of eternity, the renewal offered to our great dream of resurrection and glory." He went on, recognizing the disastrous conditions under which Rome laboured as a capital. She was a purely decorative city with exhausted soil, she had remained apart from modern life, she was unhealthy, she offered no possibility of commerce or industry, she was invincibly preyed upon by death, standing as she did amidst that sterile desert of the Campagna. Then he compared her with the other cities which are jealous of her. First Florence, which, however, has become so indifferent and so sceptical, impregnated with a happy heedlessness which seems inexplicable when one remembers the frantic passions and the torrents of blood rolling through her history. Next Naples, which yet remains content with her bright sun, and whose childish people enjoy their ignorance and wretchedness so indolently that one knows not whether one ought to pity them. Next Venice, which has resigned herself to remaining a marvel of ancient art, which one ought to put under glass so as to preserve her intact, slumbering amid the sovereign pomp of her annals. Next Genoa, which is absorbed in trade, still active and bustling, one of the last queens of that Mediterranean, that insignificant lake which was once the opulent central sea, whose waters carried the wealth of the world. And then particularly Turin and Milan, those industrial and commercial centres, which are so full of life and so modernized that tourists disdain them as not being Italian cities, both of them having saved themselves from ruin by entering into that Western evolution which is preparing the next century. Ah, that old land of Italy! One ought to leave it all as a dusty museum for the pleasure of artistic souls, leave it to crumble away, even as its little towns of Magna Grecia, Umbria, and Tuscany are already crumbling, like exquisite bibelots which one dares not repair for fear that one might spoil their character. At all events there must either be death soon and inevitable, or else the pick of the demolisher, the tottering walls thrown to the ground, and cities of labour, science, and health created on all sides. In one word, a new Italy really rising from the ashes of the old one, and adapted to the new civilization into which humanity is entering. "However, why despair?" Orlando continued energetically. "Rome may weigh heavily on our shoulders, but she is none the less the summit we coveted. We are here, and we shall stay here awaiting events. Even if the population does not increase, it at least remains stationary at a figure of some 400,000 souls, and the movement of increase may set in again when the causes which stopped it shall have ceased. Our blunder was to think that Rome would become a Paris or Berlin. But so far all sorts of social, historical, even ethnical considerations seem opposed to it. Yet who can tell what may be the surprises of tomorrow? Are we forbidden to hope, to put faith in the blood which courses in our veins, the blood of the old conquerors of the world? I, who no longer stir from this room, impotent as I am, even I at times feel my madness come back, believe in the invincibility and immortality of Rome, and wait for the 2 millions of people who must come to populate those dolorous new districts which you have seen so empty and already falling into ruins. And certainly they will come. Why not? You will see, you will see. Everything will be populated, and even more houses will have to be built. Moreover, can you call a nation poor when it possesses Lombardy? Is there not also inexhaustible wealth in our southern provinces? Let peace settle down, let the south and the north mingle together, and a new generation of workers grow up. Since we have the soil, such a fertile soil, the great harvest which is awaited will surely some day sprout and ripen under the burning sun. Enthusiasm was upbuoying him. All the furia of youth inflamed his eyes. Pierre smiled, won over, and as soon as he was able to speak, he said, "The problem must be tackled down below, among the people. You must make men." "Exactly," cried Orlando. "I don't cease repeating it. One must make Italy." It is as if a wind from the east had blown the seed of humanity, the seed which makes vigorous and powerful nations, elsewhere. Our people is not like yours in France, a reservoir of men and money from which one can draw as plentifully as one pleases. It is such another inexhaustible reservoir that I wish to see created among us. And one must begin at the bottom. There must be schools everywhere. Ignorance must be stamped out, brutishness and idleness must be fought with books, intellectual and moral instruction must give us the industrious people which we need if we are not to disappear from among the great nations. And once again for whom, if not for the democracy of tomorrow, have we worked in taking possession of Rome? And how easily one can understand that all should collapse here, and nothing grow up vigorously since such a democracy is absolutely absent. Yes, the solution of the problem does not lie elsewhere. We must make a people, make an Italian democracy. Pierre had grown calm again, feeling somewhat anxious, yet not daring to say that it is by no means easy to modify a nation, that Italy is such as soil, history, and race have made her, and that to seek to transform her so radically and all at once might be a dangerous enterprise. Do not nations, like beings, have an active youth, a resplendent prime, and a more or less prolonged old age ending in death? A modern democratic Rome, good heavens! The modern Romes are named Paris, London, Chicago. So he contented himself with saying, "But pending this great renovation of the people, don't you think that you ought to be prudent? Your finances are in such a bad condition, you are passing through such great social and economic difficulties, that you run the risk of the worst catastrophes before you secure either men or money. Ah, how prudent would that minister be who should say in your chambers, 'Our pride has made a mistake. It was wrong of us to try to make ourselves a great nation in one day. More time, labour, and patience are needed, and we consent to remain for the present a young nation, which will quietly reflect and labour at self-formation, without, for a long time yet, seeking to play a dominant part. So we intend to disarm, to strike out the war and naval estimates, all the estimates intended for display abroad, in order to devote ourselves to our internal prosperity, and to build up by education, physically and morally, the great nation which we swear we will be 50 years hence. Yes, strike out all needless expenditure. Your salvation lies in that." But Orlando, while listening, had become gloomy again, and with a vague, weary gesture he replied in an undertone, No, the minister who should use such language would be hooted. It would be too hard a confession, such as one cannot ask a nation to make. Every heart would bound, leap forth at the idea. And besides, would not the danger perhaps be even greater if all that has been done were allowed to crumble? How many wrecked hopes, how much discarded, useless material there would be! No, we can now only save ourselves by patience and courage, and forward, ever forward. We are a very young nation, and in 50 years we desired to effect the unity which others have required 200 years to arrive at. Well, we must pay for our haste, we must wait for the harvest to ripen, and fill our barns. Then, with another and more sweeping wave of the arm, he stubbornly strengthened himself in his hopes. "You know," said he, "that I was always against the alliance with Germany. As I predicted, it has ruined us. We were not big enough to march side by side with such a wealthy and powerful person. And it is in view of a war, always near at hand and inevitable, that we now suffer so cruelly from having to support the budgets of a great nation. Ah, that war which has never come, it is that which has exhausted the best part of our blood and sap and money without the slightest profit. Today we have nothing before us but the necessity of breaking with our ally, who speculated on our pride, who has never helped us in any way, who has never given us anything but bad advice, and treated us otherwise than with suspicion. But it was all inevitable, and that's what people won't admit in France. I can speak freely of it all, for I am a declared friend of France, and people even feel some spite against me on that account. However, explain to your compatriots that on the morrow of our conquest of Rome, in our frantic desire to resume our ancient rank, it was absolutely necessary that we should play our part in Europe and show that we were a power with whom the others must henceforth count. And hesitation was not allowable. All our interests impelled us toward Germany. The evidence was so blinding as to impose itself. The stern law of the struggle for life weighs as heavily on nations as on individuals, and this it is which explains and justifies the rupture between the two sisters, France and Italy, the forgetting of so many ties, race, commercial intercourse, and, if you like, services also. The two sisters, they now pursue each other with so much hatred that all common sense even seems at an end. My poor old heart bleeds when I read the articles which your newspapers and ours exchange like poisoned darts. When will this fratricidal massacre cease? Which of the two will first realize the necessity of peace, the necessity of the alliance of the Latin races, if they are to remain alive amidst those torrents of other races which more and more invade the world? Then gaily, with the bonhomie of a hero disarmed by old age, and seeking a refuge in his dreams, Orlando added, "Come, you must promise to help me as soon as you are in Paris. However small your field of action may be, promise me you will do all you can to promote peace between France and Italy. There can be no more holy task. Relate all you have seen here, all you have heard. As frankly as possible. If we have faults, you certainly have faults as well. And come, family quarrels can't last forever." "No doubt," Pierre answered in some embarrassment. "Unfortunately, they are the most tenacious. In families, when blood becomes exasperated with blood, hate goes as far as poison and the knife, and pardon becomes impossible." He dared not fully express his thoughts. Since he had been in Rome, listening and considering things, the quarrel between Italy and France had resumed itself in his mind in a fine tragic story. Once upon a time there were two princesses, daughters of a powerful queen, the mistress of the world. The elder one, who had inherited her mother's kingdom, was secretly grieved to see her sister, who had established herself in a neighbouring land, gradually increase in wealth, strength, and brilliancy, whilst she herself declined as if weakened by age, dismembered, so exhausted and so sore, that she already felt defeated on the day when she attempted a supreme effort to regain universal power. And so how bitter were her feelings, how hurt she always felt on seeing her sister recover from the most frightful shocks, resume her dazzling gala, and continue to reign over the world by dint of strength and grace and wit. Never would she forgive it, however well that envied and detested sister might act towards her. Therein lay an incurable wound, the life of one poisoned by that of the other, the hatred of old blood for young blood, which could only be quieted by death. And even if peace, as was possible, should soon be restored between them in presence of the younger sister's evident triumph, the other would always harbour deep within her heart an endless grief at being the elder yet the vassal. "However, you may rely on me," Pierre affectionately resumed. "This quarrel between the two countries is certainly a great source of grief and a great peril, and assuredly I will only say what I think to be the truth about you. At the same time I fear that you hardly like the truth, for temperament and custom have hardly prepared you for it. The poets of every nation who at various times have written on Rome have intoxicated you with so much praise that you are scarcely fitted to hear the real truth about your Rome of today. No matter how superb a share of praise one may accord you, one must all the same look at the reality of things. And this reality is just what you won't admit, lovers of the beautiful as you ever are, susceptible too, like women, whom the slightest hint of a wrinkle sends into despair." Orlando began to laugh. "Well, certainly one must always beautify things a little," said he. "Why speak of ugly faces at all? We in our theatres only care for pretty music, pretty dancing, pretty pieces which please one. As for the rest, whatever is disagreeable, let us hide it, for mercy's sake." "On the other hand," the priest continued, "I will cheerfully confess the great error of my book. The Italian Rome which I neglected and sacrificed to papal Rome not only exists, but is already so powerful and triumphant that it is surely the other one which is bound to disappear in the course of time. However much the Pope may strive to remain immutable within his Vatican, a steady evolution goes on around him, and the black world, by mingling with the white, has already become a grey world. I never realized that more acutely than at the fête given by Prince Buongiovanni for the betrothal of his daughter to your grandnephew. I came away quite enchanted, won over to the cause of your resurrection." The old man's eyes sparkled. "Ah, you were present," said he, "and you witnessed a never-to-be-forgotten scene, did you not? And you no longer doubt our vitality, our growth into a great people when the difficulties of today are overcome. What does a quarter of a century, what does even a century matter? Italy will again rise to her old glory, as soon as the great people of tomorrow shall have sprung from the soil. And if I detest that man Sacco, it is because to my mind he is the incarnation of all the enjoyers and intriguers whose appetite for the spoils of our conquest has retarded everything. But I live again in my dear grandnephew Attilio, who represents the future, the generation of brave and worthy men who will purify and educate the country. Ah, may some of the great ones of tomorrow spring from him and that adorable little Princess Celia, whom my niece Stephana, a sensible woman at bottom, brought to see me the other day. If you had seen that child fling her arms about me, call me endearing names, and tell me that I should be a godfather to her first son, so that he might bear my name and once again save Italy. Yes, yes, may peace be concluded around that coming cradle. May the union of those dear children be the indissoluble marriage of Rome and the whole nation, and may all be repaired, and all blossom anew in their love." Tears came to his eyes, and Pierre, touched by his inextinguishable patriotism, sought to please him. "I myself," said he, "expressed to your son much the same wish on the evening of the betrothal fête, when I told him I trusted that their nuptials might be definitive and fruitful, and that from them and all the others there might arise the great nation which, now that I begin to know you, I hope you will soon become." "You said that," exclaimed Orlando. "Well, I forgive your book, for you have understood at last. And New Rome, there she is, the Rome which is ours, which we wish to make worthy of her glorious past, and for the third time the Queen of the world." With one of those broad gestures into which he put all his remaining life, he pointed to the curtainless window where Rome spread out in solemn majesty from one horizon to the other. But suddenly he turned his head, and in a fit of paternal indignation began to apostrophize young Angelo Mascara. "You young rascal," said he, "it's our Rome which you dream of destroying with your bombs, which you talk of razing like a rotten, tottering house, so as to rid the world of it forever." Angiolo had hitherto remained silent, passionately listening to the others. His pretty, girlish, beardless face reflected the slightest emotion in sudden flushes, and his big blue eyes also had glowed on hearing what had been said of the people, the new people which it was necessary to create. "Yes," he slowly replied in his pure and musical voice, "we mean to raise it and not leave a stone of it, but raise it in order to build it up again." Orlando interrupted him with a soft, bantering laugh. "Oh, you would build it up again? That's fortunate," he said. "I would build it up again," the young man replied in the trembling voice of an inspired prophet. "I would build it up again. Oh, so vast, so beautiful, and so noble. Will not the universal democracy of tomorrow, humanity when it is at last freed, need a unique city, which shall be the Ark of Alliance, the very centre of the world? And is not Rome designated, Rome which the prophecies have marked as eternal and immortal, where the destinies of the nations are to be accomplished? But in order that it may become the final definitive sanctuary, the capital of the destroyed kingdoms, where the wise men of all countries shall meet once every year, one must first of all purify it by fire, leave nothing of its old stains remaining. Then, when the sun shall have absorbed all the pestilence of the old soil, we will rebuild the city 10 times more beautiful and 10 times larger than it has ever been. And what a city of truth and justice it will at last be, the Rome that has been announced and awaited for 3,000 years, all in gold and all in marble. filling the Campagna from the sea to the Sabine and the Alban mountains, and so prosperous and so sensible that its 20 millions of inhabitants, after regulating the law of labour, will live with the unique joy of being. Yes, yes, Rome the mother, Rome the queen, alone on the face of the earth and for all eternity. Pierre listened to him aghast. What, did the blood of Augustus go to such a point as this? The popes had not become masters of Rome without feeling impelled to rebuild it in their passion to rule over the world. Young Italy, likewise yielding to the hereditary madness of universal domination, had in its turn sought to make the city larger than any other, erecting whole districts for people who had never come, and now even the anarchists were possessed by the same stubborn dream of the race, a dream beyond all measure this time, a fourth and monstrous Rome, whose suburbs would invade continents in order that liberated humanity, united in one family, might find sufficient lodging. This was the climax. Never could more extravagant proof be given of the blood of pride and sovereignty which had scorched the veins of that race ever since Augustus had bequeathed it the inheritance of his absolute empire, with the furious instinct that the world legally belonged to it, and that its mission was to conquer it again. This idea had intoxicated all the children of that historic soil, impelling all of them to make their city the city, the one which had reigned and which would reign again in splendour when the days predicted by the oracles should arrive. And Pierre remembered the 4 fatidical letters, the SPQR of old and glorious Rome, which, like an order of final triumph given to destiny, he had everywhere found in present-day Rome, on all the walls, on all the insignia, even on the municipal dust-carts. And he understood the prodigious vanity of these people, haunted by the glory of their ancestors, spellbound by the past of their city, declaring that she contains everything, that they themselves cannot know her thoroughly, that she is the Sphinx who will some day explain the riddle of the universe, that she is so great and noble that all within her acquires increase of greatness and nobility, in such wise that they demand for her the idolatrous respect of the entire world, so vivacious in their minds is the elusive legend which clings to her, so incapable are they of realizing that what was once great may be so no longer. "But I know your fourth Rome," resumed Orlando, again enlivened. "It's the Rome of the people, the capital of the Universal Republic, which Mazzini dreamt of. Only he left the Pope in it. Do you know, my lad, that if we old republicans rallied to the monarchy, it was because we feared that in the event of revolution the country might fall into the hands of dangerous madmen, such as those who have upset your brain. Yes, that was why we resigned ourselves to our monarchy, which is not much different from a parliamentary republic. And now, goodbye, and be sensible. Remember that your poor mother would die of it if any misfortune should befall you. Come, let me embrace you all the same." On receiving the hero's affectionate kiss, Angiolo coloured like a girl. Then he went off with his gentle, dreamy air, never adding a word, but politely inclining his head to the priest. Silence continued till Orlando's eyes encountered the newspapers scattered on the table, when he once more spoke of the terrible bereavement of the Boccaneras. He had loved Benedetta like a dear daughter during the sad days when she had dwelt near him, and finding the newspaper accounts of her death somewhat singular, worried in fact by the obscure points which he could divine in the tragedy, he was asking Pierre for particulars, when his son Luigi suddenly entered the room, breathless from having climbed the stairs so quickly and with his face full of anxious fear. He had just dismissed his contractors with impatient roughness, giving no thought to his serious financial position, the jeopardy in which his fortune was now placed. So anxious was he to be up above beside his father. And when he was there, his first uneasy glance was for the old man, to make sure whether the priest by some imprudent word had not dealt him his death-blow. He shuddered on noticing how Orlando quivered, moved to tears by the terrible affair of which he was speaking, and for a moment he thought he had arrived too late, that the harm was done. "Good heavens, father!" he exclaimed. "What is the matter with you? Why are you crying?" And as he spoke he knelt at the old man's feet, taking hold of his hands and giving him such a passionate, loving glance, that he seemed to be offering all the blood of his heart to spare him the slightest grief. "It is about the death of that poor woman," Orlando sadly answered. "I was telling Monsieur Froment how it grieved me, and I added that I could not yet understand it all. The papers talk of a sudden death which is always so extraordinary." The young count rose again, looking very pale. The priest had not yet spoken. But what a frightful moment was this! What if he should reply? What if he should speak out? "You were present, were you not?" continued the old man, addressing Pierre. "You saw everything. Tell me, then, how the thing happened." Luigi Prada looked at Pierre. Their eyes met fixedly, plunging into one another's souls. All began afresh in their minds, destiny on the march, Santobono encountered with his little basket, the drive across the melancholy Campagna, the conversation about poison while the little basket was gently rocked on the priest's knees. Then, in particular, the sleepy osteria, and the little black hen, so suddenly killed, lying on the ground with a tiny streamlet of violet blood trickling from her beak. And next there was that splendid ball at the Buongiovanni mansion, with all its odore di femmina and its triumph of love. And finally, before the Palazzo Bocconera, so black under the silvery moon, there was the man who lighted a cigar and went off without once turning his head, allowing dim destiny to accomplish its work of death. Both of them, Pierre and Prada, knew that story and lived it over again, having no need to recall it aloud in order to make certain that they had fully penetrated one another's soul. Pierre did not immediately answer the old man. "Oh," he murmured at last, "there were frightful things. Yes, frightful things." "No doubt. That is what I suspected," resumed Orlando. "You can tell us all. In presence of death my son has freely forgiven." The young count's gaze again sought that of Pierre with such weight, such ardent entreaty that the priest felt deeply stirred. He had just remembered that man's anguish during the ball, the atrocious torture of jealousy which he had undergone before allowing destiny to avenge him. And he pictured also what must have been his feelings after the terrible outcome of it all. At first stupefaction at destiny's harshness, at this full vengeance which he had never desired so ferocious. Then icy calmness like that of the cool gambler who awaits events, reading the newspapers, and feeling no other remorse than that of the general whose victory has cost him too many men. He must have immediately realized that the cardinal would stifle the affair for the sake of the Church's honour, and only retained one weight on his heart, regret possibly for that woman whom he had never won, with perhaps a last horrible jealousy which he did not confess to himself, but from which he would always suffer, jealousy at knowing that she lay in another's arms in the grave, for all eternity. But behold, after that victorious effort to remain calm, after that cold and remorseless waiting, punishment arose, the fear that destiny, travelling on with its poisoned figs, might have not yet ceased its march, and might by a rebound strike down his own father. Yet another thunderbolt, yet another victim, the most unexpected, the being he most adored. At that thought all his strength of resistance had in one moment collapsed, and he was there, in terror of destiny, more at a loss, more trembling than a child. "The newspapers, however," slowly said Pierre, as if he were seeking his words, "the newspapers must have told you that the prince succumbed first, and that the Contessina died of grief whilst embracing him for the last time. As for the cause of death, mon Dieu, you know that doctors themselves in sudden cases scarcely dare to pronounce an exact opinion." He stopped short, for within him he had suddenly heard the voice of Benedetta giving him, just before she died, that terrible order. "You, who will see his father, I charge you to tell him that I cursed his son. I wish that he should know, it is necessary that he should know, for the sake of truth and justice." And was he, O Lord, about to obey that order? Was it one of those divine commands which must be executed even if the result be a torrent of blood and tears? For a few seconds Pierre suffered from a heart-rending combat within him, hesitating between the act of truth and justice which the dead woman had called for, and his own personal desire for forgiveness, and the horror he would feel should he kill that poor old man by fulfilling his implacable mission which could benefit nobody. And certainly the other one, the son, must have understood what a supreme struggle was going on in the priest's mind, a struggle which would decide his own father's fate, for his glance became yet more suppliant than ever. "One first thought that it was merely indigestion," continued Pierre, "but the prince became so much worse that one was alarmed, and the doctor was sent for." Ah, Prada's eyes, they had become so despairing, so full of the most touching and weightiest things, that the priest could read in them all the decisive reasons which were about to stay his tongue. No, no, he would not strike an innocent old man. He had promised nothing, and to obey the last expression of the dead woman's hatred would have seemed to him like charging her memory with a crime. The young count, too, during those few minutes of anguish, had suffered a whole life of such abominable torture that after all some little justice was done. And then, Pierre concluded, When the doctor arrived, he at once recognized that it was a case of infectious fever. There can be no doubt of it. This morning I attended the funeral. It was very splendid and very touching." Orlando did not insist, but contented himself with saying that he also had felt much emotion all the morning on thinking of that funeral. Then, as he turned to set the papers on the table in order with his trembling hands, his son, icy cold with perspiration, staggering and clinging to the back of a chair in order that he might not fall, again gave Pierre a long glance, but a very soft one, full of distracted gratitude. "I am leaving this evening," resumed Pierre, who felt exhausted and wished to break off the conversation, "and I must now bid you farewell. Have you any commission to give me for Paris?" "No, none," replied Orlando, and then with sudden recollection he added, "Yes, I have, though. You remember that book written by my old comrade in arms, Théophile Morin, one of Garibaldi's 1,000? That manual for the bachelor's degree which he desired to see translated and adopted here? Well, I am pleased to say that I have a promise that it shall be used in our schools, but on condition that he makes some alterations in it. Luigi, give me the book. It is there on that shelf." Then, when his son had handed him the volume, he showed Pierre some notes which he had pencilled on the margins, and explained to him the modifications which were desired in the general scheme of the work. "Will you be kind enough," he continued, "to take this copy to Morin himself? His address is written inside the cover. If you can do so, you will spare me the trouble of writing him a very long letter. In 10 minutes you can explain matters to him more clearly and completely than I could do in 10 pages. And you must embrace Morin for me, and tell him that I still love him, oh, with all my heart, of the bygone days, when I could still use my legs, and we two fought like devils side by side under a hail of bullets." A short silence followed, that pause, that embarrassment tinged with emotion which precedes the moment of farewell. "Come, good-bye," said Orlando. "Embrace me for him and for yourself. Embrace me affectionately like that lad did just now. I am so old and so near my end, my dear Monsieur Froment, that you will allow me to call you my child and kiss you like a grandfather, wishing you all courage and peace, and that faith in life which alone helps one to live." Pierre was so touched that tears rose to his eyes, and when with all his soul he kissed the stricken hero on either cheek, he felt that he likewise was weeping. With a hand yet as vigorous as a vice, Orlando detained him for a moment beside his armchair, whilst with his other hand waving in a supreme gesture, he for the last time showed him Rome, so immense and mournful under the ashen sky. And his voice came low, quivering and suppliant. "For mercy's sake, swear to me that you will love her all the same, in spite of all, for she is the cradle, the mother. Love her for all that she no longer is, love her for all that she desires to be. Do not say that her end has come. Love her so that she may live again, that she may live forever." Pierre again embraced him, unable to find any other response, upset as he was by all the passion displayed by that old warrior, who spoke of his city as a man of 30 might speak of the woman he adores. And he found him so handsome and so lofty, with his old blanched leonine mane and his stubborn belief in approaching resurrection, that once more the other old Roman, Cardinal Boccanera, arose before him, equally stubborn in his faith and relinquishing naught of his dream, even though he might be crushed on the spot by the fall of the heavens. These twain ever stood face to face, at either end of their city, alone rearing their lofty figures above the horizon, whilst awaiting the future. Then, when Pierre had bowed to Count Luigi, and found himself outside again in the Via 20 Settembre, he was all eagerness to get back to the Boccanera mansion so as to pack up his things and depart. His farewell visits were made, and he now only had to take leave of Donna Serafina and the Cardinal, and to thank them for all their kind hospitality. For him alone did their doors open, for they had shut themselves up on returning from the funeral, resolved to see nobody. At twilight, therefore, Pierre had no one but Victorine to keep him company in the vast black mansion. For when he expressed a desire to take supper with Don Vigilio, she told him that the latter had also shut himself up in his room. Desirous as he was of at least shaking hands with the secretary for the last time, Pierre went to knock at the door, which was so near his own, but could obtain no reply, and divined that the poor fellow, overcome by a fresh attack of fever and suspicion, desired not to see him again, in terror at the idea that he might compromise himself yet more than he had done already. Thereupon it was settled that, as the train only started at 17 minutes past 10, Victorine should serve Pierre his supper on the little table in his sitting-room at 8 o'clock. She brought him a lamp and spoke of putting his linen in order, but he absolutely declined her help, and she had to leave him to pack up quietly by himself. He had purchased a little box, since his valise could not possibly hold all the linen and winter clothing which had been sent to him from Paris, as his stay in Rome became more and more protracted. However, the packing was soon accomplished. The wardrobe was emptied, the drawers were visited, the box and valise filled and securely locked by 7 o'clock. An hour remained to him before supper, and he sat there resting, when his eyes, whilst travelling round the walls to make sure he had forgotten nothing, encountered that old painting by some unknown master, which had so often filled him with emotion. The lamplight now shone full upon it, and this time again as he gazed at it he felt a blow in the heart, a blow which was all the deeper, as now, at this parting hour, he found a symbol of his defeat at Rome in that dolent, tragic, half-naked woman, draped in a shred of linen, and weeping between her clasped hands while seated on the threshold of the palace whence she had been driven. Did not that rejected one, that stubborn victim of love, who sobbed so bitterly, and of whom one knew nothing, neither what her face was like, nor whence she had come, nor what her fault had been, did she not personify all man's useless efforts to force the doors of truth, and all the frightful abandonment into which he falls as soon as he collides with the wall which shuts the unknown off from him? For a long while did Pierre look at her, again worried at being obliged to depart without having seen her face behind her streaming golden hair. That face of dolorous beauty which he pictured radiant with youth and delicious in its mystery. And as he gazed, he was just fancying that he could see it, that it was becoming his at last, when there was a knock at the door, and Narcisse Abbe entered. End of section 31. Section 32 of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rome by Émile ZOLA, translated by Ernest VIZETELLY. Chapter 16, Part 2. Pierre was surprised to see the young attaché, for 3 days previously he had started for Florence, impelled thither by one of the sudden whims of his artistic fancy. However, he at once apologized for his unceremonious intrusion. "Ah, there is your luggage," he said. "I heard that you were going away this evening, and I was unwilling to let you leave Rome without coming to shake hands with you. But what frightful things have happened since we met. I only returned this afternoon, so that I could not attend the funeral. However, you may well imagine how thunderstruck I was by the news of those frightful deaths." Then, suspecting some unacknowledged tragedy, like a man well acquainted with the legendary dark side of Rome, he put some questions to Pierre, but did not insist on them, being at bottom far too prudent to burden himself uselessly with redoubtable secrets. And after Pierre had given him such particulars as he thought fit, the conversation changed, and they spoke at length of Italy, Rome, Naples, and Florence. "Ah, Florence, Florence," Narcisse repeated languorously. He had lighted a cigarette, and his words fell more slowly as he glanced round the room. "You were very well lodged here," he said. "It is very quiet. I had never come up to this floor before." His eyes continued wandering over the walls until they were at last arrested by the old painting which the lamp illumined, and thereupon he remained for a moment blinking as if surprised. And all at once he rose and approached the picture. dear me," said he, "but that's very good, that's very fine." "Isn't it?" rejoined Pierre. "I know nothing about painting, but I was stirred by that picture on the very day of my arrival, and over again it has kept me here with my heart beating and full of indescribable feelings." Narcisse no longer spoke, but examined the painting with the care of a connoisseur, an expert, whose keen glance decides the question of authenticity and appraises commercial value. And the most extraordinary delight appeared upon the young man's fair, rapturous face, whilst his fingers began to quiver. "But it's a Botticelli! It's a Botticelli! There can be no doubt about it," he exclaimed. "Just look at the hands, and look at the folds of the drapery, and the colour of the hair, and the technique, the flow of the whole composition. A Botticelli! Ah, mon Dieu, a Botticelli!" He became quite faint, overflowing with increasing admiration as he penetrated more and more deeply into the subject, at once so simple and so poignant. Was it not acutely modern? The artist had foreseen our pain-fraught century, our anxiety in presence of the invisible, our distress at being unable to cross the portal of mystery which was forever closed. And what an eternal symbol of the world's wretchedness was that woman, whose face one could not see, and who sobbed so distractedly without it being possible for one to wipe away her tears. Yes, a Botticelli, unknown, uncatalogued. What a discovery! Then he paused to inquire of Pierre, "Did you know it was a Botticelli?" "Oh no, I spoke to Don Vigilio about it one day, but he seemed to think it of no account. And Victorine, when I spoke to her, replied that all those old things only served to harbour dust." Narcisse protested, quite stupefied. "What? They have a Botticelli here and don't know it? Ah, how well I recognize in that the Roman princes, who, unless their masterpieces have been labelled, are for the most part utterly at sea among them. No doubt this one has suffered a little, but a simple cleaning would make a marvel, a famous picture of it, for which a museum would at least give—" He abruptly stopped, completing his sentence with a wave of the hand, and not mentioning the figure which was on his lips. And then, as Victorine came in, followed by Giacomo, to lay the little table for Pierre's supper, he turned his back upon the Botticelli and said no more about it. The young priest's attention was aroused, however, and he could well divine what was passing in the other's mind. Under that make-believe Florentine, all angelicalness, there was an experienced businessman, who well knew how to look after his pecuniary interests, and was even reported to be somewhat avaricious. Pierre, who was aware of it, could not help smiling, therefore, when he saw him take his stand before another picture, a frightful Virgin badly copied from some 18th-century canvas, and exclaim, "Dear me, that's not at all bad. I've a friend, I remember, who asked me to buy him some old paintings. I say, Victorine, now that Donna Serafina and the Cardinal are left alone, do you think they would like to rid themselves of a few valueless pictures?" The servant raised her arms as if to say that if it depended on her, everything might be carried away. Then she replied, "Not to a dealer, sir, on account of the nasty rumours which would at once spread about, but I'm sure they would be happy to please a friend. The house costs a lot to keep up, and money would be welcome." Pierre then vainly endeavoured to persuade Narcisse to stay and sup with him, but the young man gave his word of honour that he was expected elsewhere and was even late. And forthwith he ran off, after pressing the priest's hands and affectionately wishing him a good journey. 8 o'clock was striking, and Pierre seated himself at the little table, Victorine remaining to serve him after dismissing Giacomo, who had brought the supper things upstairs in a basket. "The people here make me wild," said the worthy woman after the other had gone. "They are so slow. And besides, it's a pleasure for me to serve you your last meal, Monsieur l'Abbé. I've had a little French dinner cooked for you, a sole au gratin and a roast fowl." Pierre was touched by this attention, and pleased to have the company of a compatriot whilst he partook of his final meal amidst the deep silence of the old, black, deserted mansion. The buxom figure of Victorine was still instinct with mourning, with grief for the loss of her dear Contessina, but her daily toil was already setting her erect again, restoring her quick activity. And she spoke almost cheerfully whilst passing plates and dishes to Pierre. "And to think, Monsieur l'Abbé," said she, "that you'll be in Paris on the morning of the day after tomorrow. As for me, you know, it seems as if I only left Orneau yesterday. Ah, what fine soil there is there! Rich soil, yellow like gold, not like their poor stuff here which smells of sulphur. And the pretty fresh willows beside our stream, too, and the little wood so full of moss. They've no moss here. Their trees look like tin under that stupid sun of theirs which burns up the grass. Mon Dieu! In the early times I would have given I don't know what for a good fall of rain to soak me and wash away all the dust. Ah, I shall never get used to their awful Rome. What a country, and what people!" Pierre was quite enlivened by her stubborn fidelity to her own nook, which after 25 years of absence still left her horrified with that city of crude light and black vegetation, true daughter as she was of a smiling and temperate clime, which of a morning was steeped in rosy mist. "But now that your young mistress is dead," said he, "what keeps you here? Why don't you take the train with me?" She looked at him in surprise. "Go off with you? Go back to Orneau? Oh, it's impossible, Monsieur l'Abbé. It would be too ungrateful to begin with, for Donna Serafina is accustomed to me, and it would be bad on my part to forsake her and His Eminence now that they are in trouble. And besides, what could I do elsewhere? No, my little hole is here now." "So you will never see Orneau again?" "No, never, that's certain." And you don't mind being buried here in their ground which smells of sulphur?" She burst into a frank laugh. "Oh," she said, "I don't mind where I am when I'm dead. One sleeps well everywhere. And it's funny that you should be so anxious as to what there may be when one's dead. There's nothing, I'm sure. That's what tranquilizes me, to feel that it will be all over and that I shall have a rest. The good God owes us that, after we've worked so hard. You know that I'm not devout. Oh dear, no. Still, that doesn't prevent me from behaving properly, and true as I stand here, I've never had a lover. It seems foolish to say such a thing at my age. Still I say it because it's the sober truth." She continued laughing like the worthy woman she was, having no belief in priests, and yet without a sin upon her conscience. And Pierre once more marvelled at the simple courage and great practical common sense of this laborious and devoted creature, who for him personified the whole unbelieving lowly class of France, those who no longer believe and will believe never more. Ah, to be as she was, to do one's work and lie down for the eternal sleep without any revolt of pride, satisfied with the one joy of having accomplished one's share of toil. When Pierre had finished his supper, Victorine summoned Giacomo to clear the things away. And as it was only 8:30, she advised the priest to spend another quiet hour in his room. Why go and catch a chill by waiting at the station? She could send for a cab at 9:30, and as soon as it arrived she would send word to him and have his luggage carried down. He might be easy as to that, and need trouble himself about nothing. When she had gone off, Pierre soon sank into a deep reverie. It seemed to him, indeed, as if he had already quitted Rome, as if the city were far away and he could look back on it, and his experiences within it. His book, New Rome, arose in his mind, and he remembered his first morning on the Janiculum, his view of Rome from the terrace of San Pietro in Montorio, a Rome such as he had dreamt of, so young and ethereal under the pure sky. It was then that he had asked himself the decisive question: could Catholicism be renewed? Could it revert to the spirit of primitive Christianity, become the religion of the democracy, the faith which the distracted modern world, in danger of death, awaits in order that it may be pacified and live? His heart had then beaten with hope and enthusiasm. After his disaster at Lourdes, from which he had scarcely recovered, he had come to attempt another and supreme experiment by asking Rome what her reply to his question would be. And now the experiment had failed. He knew what answer Rome had returned him through her ruins, her monuments, her very soil, her people, her prelates, her cardinals, her pope. No, Catholicism could not be renewed. No, it could not revert to the spirit of primitive Christianity. No, it could not become the religion of the democracy, the new faith which might save the old toppling societies in danger of death. Though it seemed to be of democratic origin, it was henceforth riveted to that Roman soil. It remained kingly in spite of everything, forced to cling to the principle of temporal power under penalty of suicide, bound by tradition, enchained by dogma, its evolutions mere simulations, whilst in reality it was reduced to such immobility that, behind the bronze doors of the Vatican, the papacy was the prisoner, the ghost of 18 centuries of atavism, indulging the ceaseless dream of universal dominion. There, where with priestly faith exalted by love of the suffering and the poor, he had come to seek life and a resurrection of the Christian communion, he had found death, the dust of a destroyed world in which nothing more could germinate, an exhausted soil whence now there could never grow aught but that despotic papacy, the master of bodies as it was of souls. To his distracted cry asking for a new religion, Rome had been content to reply by condemning his book as a work tainted with heresy, and he himself had withdrawn it amidst the bitter grief of his disillusions. He had seen, he had understood, and all had collapsed. And it was himself, his soul and his brain, which lay among the ruins. Pierre was stifling. He rose, threw the window overlooking the Tiber wide open, and leant out. The rain had begun to fall again at the approach of evening, but now it had once more ceased. The atmosphere was very mild, moist, even oppressive. The moon must have arisen in the ashen grey sky, for her presence could be divined behind the clouds which she illumined with a vague, yellow, mournful light. And under that slumberous glimmer the vast horizon showed blackly and phantom-like. The Janiculum in front, with the close-packed houses of the Trastevere, the river flowing away yonder on the left towards the dim height of the Palatine, whilst on the right the dome of St. Peter's showed forth, round and domineering in the pale atmosphere. Pierre could not see the Quirinal, but divined it to be behind him, and could picture its long façade shutting off part of the sky. And what a collapsing Rome, half devoured by the gloom, was this! So different from the Rome, all youth and dreamland, which he had beheld and passionately loved on the day of his arrival. He remembered the three symbolic summits which had then summed up for him the whole long history of Rome, the ancient, the papal, and the Italian city. But if the Palatine had remained the same discrowned mount on which there only rose the phantom of the ancestor, Augustus, Emperor and Pontiff, master of the world, he now pictured St. Peter's and the Quirinal as strangely altered. To that royal palace which he had so neglected, and which had seemed to him like a flat, low barrack, to that new government which had brought him the impression of some attempt at sacrilegious modernity, he now accorded the large, increasing space that they occupied in the panorama, the whole of which they would apparently soon fill, whilst on the contrary St. Peter's, that dome which he had found so triumphal, all azure, reigning over the city like a gigantic and unshakable monarch, at present seemed to him full of cracks and already shrinking, as if it were one of those huge old piles which, through the secret, unsuspected decay of their timbers, at times fall to the ground in one mass. A murmur, a growling plaint, rose from the swollen Tiber, and Pierre shivered at the icy abysmal breath which swept past his face. And his thoughts of the three summits and their symbolic triangle aroused within him the memory of the sufferings of the great silent multitude of poor and lowly, for whom Pope and King had so long disputed. It all dated from long ago, from the day when, in dividing the inheritance of Augustus, the Emperor had been obliged to content himself with men's bodies, leaving their souls to the Pope, whose one idea had henceforth been to gain the temporal power of which God, in his person, was despoiled. All the Middle Ages had been disturbed and ensanguined by the quarrel, till at last the silent multitude, weary of vexations and miseries, spoke out, threw off the papal yoke at the Reformation, and later on began to overthrow its kings. And then, as Pierre had written in his book, a new fortune had been offered to the Pope, that of reverting to the ancient dream, by dissociating himself from the fallen thrones and placing himself on the side of the wretched, in the hope that this time he would conquer the people, win it entirely for himself. Was it not prodigious to see that man, Leo XIII, despoiled of his kingdom, allowing himself to be called a socialist, assembling under his banner the great flock of the disinherited, and marching against the kings at the head of that fourth estate to whom the coming century will belong? The eternal struggle for possession of the people continued as bitterly as ever, even in Rome itself, where Pope and King, who could see each other from their windows, contended together like falcon and hawk for the little birds of the woods. And in this for Pierre lay the reason why Catholicism was fatally condemned, for it was of monarchical essence to such a point that the Apostolic and Roman papacy could not renounce the temporal power under penalty of becoming something else and disappearing. In vain did it feign a return to the people, in vain did it seek to appear all-soul. There was no room in the midst of the world's democracies for any such total and universal sovereignty as that which it claimed to hold from God. Pierre ever beheld the Imperator sprouting up afresh in the Pontifex Maximus, and it was this in particular which had killed his dream, destroyed his book, heaped up all those ruins before which he remained distracted without either strength or courage. The sight of that ashen Rome, whose edifices faded away into the night, at last brought him such a heart-pang that he came back into the room and fell on a chair near his luggage. Never before had he experienced such distress of spirit. It seemed like the death of his soul. After his disaster at Lourdes, he had not come to Rome in search of the candid and complete faith of a little child, but the superior faith of an intellectual being, rising above rites and symbols, and seeking to ensure the greatest possible happiness of mankind based on its need of certainty. And if this collapsed, if Catholicism could not be rejuvenated and become the religion and moral law of the new generations, if the Pope at Rome and with Rome could not be the father, the arch of alliance, the spiritual leader whom all hearkened to and obeyed, why then, in Pierre's eyes, the last hope was wrecked, the supreme rending which must plunge present-day society into the abyss was near at hand. That scaffolding of Catholic socialism, which had seemed to him so happily devised for the consolidation of the old Church, now appeared to him lying on the ground, and he judged it severely as a mere passing expedient which might perhaps for some years prop up the ruined edifice, but which was simply based on an intentional misunderstanding, on a skilful lie, on politics and diplomacy. No, no. that the people should once again, as so many times before, be duped and gained over, caressed in order that it might be enthralled. This was repugnant to one's reason, and the whole system appeared degenerate, dangerous, temporary, calculated to end in the worst catastrophes. So this then was the finish. Nothing remained erect and stable. The old world was about to disappear amidst the frightful sanguinary crisis whose approach was announced by such indisputable signs. And he, before that chaos near at hand, had no soul left him, having once more lost his faith in that decisive experiment which, he had felt beforehand, would either strengthen him or strike him down for ever. The thunderbolt had fallen, and now, O God, what should he do? To shake off his anguish, he began to walk across the room. Ay, what should he do now that he was all doubt again, all dolorous negation, and that his cassock weighed more heavily than it had ever weighed upon his shoulders? He remembered having told Monsignor Nani that he would never submit, would never be able to resign himself and kill his hope in salvation by love, but would rather reply by a fresh book, in which he would say in what new soil the new religion would spring up. Yes, a flaming book against Rome, in which he would set down all he had seen, a book which would depict the real Rome, the Rome which knows neither charity nor love, and is dying in the pride of its purple. He had spoken of returning to Paris, leaving the church and going to the point of schism. Well, his luggage now lay there packed. He was going off, and he would write that book. He would be the great schismatic who was awaited. Did not everything foretell approaching schism amidst that great movement of men's minds, weary of old mummified dogmas and yet hungering for the divine? Even Leo XIII must be conscious of it, for his whole policy, his whole effort towards Christian unity, his assumed affection for the democracy had no other object than that of grouping the whole family around the papacy, and consolidating it so as to render the Pope invincible in the approaching struggle. But the times had come. Catholicism would soon find that it could grant no more political concessions without perishing, that at Rome it was reduced to the immobility of an ancient hieratic idol, and that only in the lands of propaganda, where it was fighting against other religions, could further evolution take place. It was indeed for this reason that Rome was condemned, the more so as the abolition of the temporal power, by accustoming men's minds to the idea of a purely spiritual papacy, seemed likely to conduce to the rise of some antipope, far away, whilst the successor of St. Peter was compelled to cling stubbornly to his apostolic and Roman fiction. A bishop, a priest would arise. Where? Who could tell? Perhaps yonder in that free America, where there are priests whom the struggle for life has turned into convinced socialists, into ardent democrats, who are ready to go forward with the coming century. And whilst Rome remains unable to relinquish aught of her past, aught of her mysteries and dogmas, that priest will relinquish all of those things which fall from one in dust. Ah, to be that priest, to be that great reformer, that saviour of modern society, what a vast dream! What a part, akin to that of a Messiah summoned by the nations in distress. For a moment Pierre was transported as by a breeze of hope and triumph. If that great change did not come in France, in Paris, it would come elsewhere, yonder across the ocean, or farther yet, wherever there might be a sufficiently fruitful soil for the new seed to spring from it in overflowing harvests. A new religion, even as he had cried on returning from Lourdes, a religion which, in particular, should not be an appetite for death, a religion which should at last realize here below that kingdom of God referred to in the Gospel, and which should equitably divide terrestrial wealth, and with the law of labour ensure the rule of truth and justice. In the fever of this fresh dream, Pierre already saw the pages of his new book flaring before him, when his eyes fell upon an object lying upon a chair, which at first surprised him. This also was a book, that work of Théophile Morin's, which Orlando had commissioned him to hand to its author, and he felt annoyed with himself at having left it there, for he might have forgotten it altogether. Before putting it into his valise, he retained it for a moment in his hand, turning its pages over, his ideas changing as by a sudden mental revolution. The work was, however, a very modest one of those manuals for the bachelor's degree containing little beyond the first elements of the sciences. Still, all the sciences were represented in it, and it gave a fair summary of the present state of human knowledge. And it was indeed science which thus burst upon Pierre's reverie with the energy of sovereign power. Not only was Catholicism swept away from his mind, but all his religious conceptions, every hypothesis of the divine tottered and fell. Only that little schoolbook, nothing but the universal desire for knowledge, that education which ever extends and penetrates the whole people. And behold, the mysteries became absurdities, the dogmas crumbled, and nothing of ancient faith was left. A nation nourished upon science, no longer believing in mysteries and dogmas, in a compensatory system of reward and punishment, is a nation whose faith is forever dead. And without faith Catholicism cannot be. Therein is the blade of the knife which falls and severs. If 1 century, if 2 centuries be needed, science will take them. She alone is eternal. It is pure naivete to say that reason is not contrary to faith. The truth is, that now already, in order to save mere fragments of the sacred writings, it has been necessary to accommodate them to the new certainties, by taking refuge in the assertion that they are simply symbolical. And what an extraordinary attitude is that of the Catholic Church, expressly forbidding all those who may discover a truth contrary to the sacred writings to pronounce upon it in definitive fashion, and ordering them to await events in the conviction that this truth will some day be proved an error. Only the Pope, says the Church, is infallible. Science is fallible, her constant groping is exploited against her, and divines remain on the watch, striving to make it appear that her discoveries of today are in contradiction with her discoveries of yesterday. What do her sacrilegious assertions, what do her certainties rending dogma asunder, matter to a Catholic, since it is certain that at the end of time she, science, will again join faith, and become the latter's very humble slave? Voluntary blindness and impudent denial of things as evident as the sunlight can no further go. But all the same, the insignificant little book, the manual of truth, travels on, continuing its work, destroying error and building up the new world, even as the infinitesimal agents of life build up our present continents. In the sudden great enlightenment which had come on him, Pierre at last felt himself on firm ground. Has science ever retreated? It is Catholicism which has always retreated before her, and will always be forced to retreat. Never does science stop. Step by step she wrests truth from error, and to say that she is bankrupt because she cannot explain the world in one word and at one effort is pure and simple nonsense. If she leaves, and no doubt always will leave, a smaller and smaller domain to mystery, and if supposition may always strive to explain that mystery, it is none the less certain that she ruins, and with each successive hour will add to the ruin of the ancient hypotheses, those which crumble away before the acquired truths. And Catholicism is in the position of those ancient hypotheses, and will be in it yet more thoroughly tomorrow. Like all religions, it is, at the bottom, but an explanation of the world, a superior social and political code, intended to bring about the greatest possible sum of peace and happiness on earth. This code, which embraces the universality of things, thenceforth becomes human and mortal like everything that is human. One cannot put it on one side and say that it exists on one side by itself, whilst science does the same on the other. Science is total, and has already shown Catholicism that such is the case, and will show it again and again by compelling it to repair the breaches incessantly effected in its ramparts, till the day of victory shall come with the final assault of resplendent truth. Frankly, it makes one laugh to hear people assign a role to science, forbid her to enter such and such a domain, predict to her that she shall go no further, and declare that at this end of the century she is already so weary that she abdicates. Oh, you little men of shallow or distorted brains, you politicians planning expedients, you dogmatics at bay, you authoritarians so obstinately clinging to the ancient dreams, science will pass on and sweep you all away like withered leaves. Pierre continued glancing through the humble little book, listening to all it told him of sovereign science. She cannot become bankrupt, for she does not promise the absolute. She is simply the progressive conquest of truth. Never has she pretended that she could give the whole truth at one effort, that sort of edifice being precisely the work of metaphysics, of revelation, of faith. The role of science, on the contrary, is only to destroy error as she gradually advances and increases enlightenment. And thus, far from becoming bankrupt, in her march which nothing stops, she remains the only possible truth for well-balanced and healthy minds. As for those whom she does not satisfy, who crave for immediate and universal knowledge, they have the resource of seeking refuge in no matter what religious hypothesis, provided, if they wish to appear in the right, that they build their fancy upon acquired certainties. Everything which is raised on proven error falls. However, although religious feeling persists among mankind, although the need of religion may be eternal, it by no means follows that Catholicism is eternal, for it is, after all, but one form of religion, which other forms preceded and which others will follow. Religions may disappear, but religious feeling will create new ones, even with the help of science. Pierre thought of that alleged repulse of science by the present-day awakening of mysticism, the causes of which he had indicated in his book, the discredit into which the idea of liberty had fallen among the people, duped in the last social reorganization, and the uneasiness of the elite, in despair at the void in which their liberated minds and enlarged intelligences have left them. It is the anguish of the unknown springing up again, but it is also only a natural and momentary reaction after so much labour, on finding that science does not yet calm our thirst for justice, our desire for security, or our ancient idea of an eternal afterlife of enjoyment. In order, however, that Catholicism might be born anew, as some seem to think it will be, the social soil would have to change, and it cannot change. It no longer possesses the sap needful for the renewal of a decaying formula which schools and laboratories destroy more and more each day. The ground is other than it once was, a different oak must spring from it. May science therefore have her religion, for such a religion will soon be the only one possible for the coming democracies, for the nations, whose knowledge ever increases whilst their Catholic faith is already naught but dust. And all at once, by way of conclusion, Pierre bethought himself of the idiocy of the Congregation of the Index. It had condemned his book, and would surely condemn the other one that he had thought of, should he ever write it. A fine piece of work, truly, to fall tooth and nail on the poor books of an enthusiastic dreamer, in which chimera contended with chimera. Yet the congregation was so foolish as not to interdict that little book which he held in his hands, that humble book which alone was to be feared, which was the ever-triumphant enemy that would surely overthrow the Church. Modest it was in its cheap get-up as a school manual, but that did not matter. Danger began with the very alphabet, increased as knowledge was acquired, and burst forth with those resumes of the physical, chemical, and natural sciences which bring the very creation, as described by Holy Writ, into question. However, the Index dared not attempt to suppress those humble volumes, those terrible soldiers of truth, those destroyers of faith. What was the use, then, of all the money which Leo XIII drew from his hidden treasure of the Peter's pence to subvention Catholic schools, with the thought of forming the believing generations which the papacy needed to enable it to conquer? What was the use of that precious money if it was only to serve for the purchase of similar insignificant yet formidable volumes, which could never be sufficiently cooked and expurgated, but would always contain too much science, that growing science which one day would blow up both Vatican and St. Peter's? Ah, that idiotic and impotent Index! What wretchedness and what derision! Then, when Pierre had placed Théophile Morin's book in his valise, he once more returned to the window, and while leaning out, beheld an extraordinary vision. Under the cloudy, coppery sky, in the mild and mournful night, patches of wavy mist had risen, hiding many of the house roofs with trailing shreds which looked like shrouds. Entire edifices had disappeared, and he imagined that the times were at last accomplished, and that truth had at last destroyed St. Peter's dome. In 100 or 1,000 years it would be like that, fallen, obliterated from the black sky. One day already he had felt it tottering and cracking beneath him, and had foreseen that this temple of Catholicism would fall even as Jove's temple had fallen on the Capitol. And it was over now, the dome had strewn the ground with fragments, and all that remained standing, in addition to a portion of the apse, were 5 columns of the central nave, still upholding a shred of entablature, and 4 cyclopean buttress piers on which the dome had rested, piers which still arose, isolated and superb, looking indestructible amongst all the surrounding downfall. But a denser mist flowed past, another 1,000 years no doubt went by, and then nothing whatever remained. The apse, the last pillars, the giant piers themselves were felled. The wind had swept away their dust, and it would have been necessary to search the soil beneath the brambles and the nettles to find a few fragments of broken statues, marbles with mutilated inscriptions, on the sense of which learned men were unable to agree. And, as formerly on the Capitol, among the buried remnants of Jupiter's temple, goats strayed and climbed through the solitude, browsing upon the bushes, amidst the deep silence of the oppressive summer sunlight, which only the buzzing flies disturbed. Then, only then, did Pierre feel the supreme collapse within him. It was really all over, science was victorious, nothing of the old world remained. What use would it be then to become the great schismatic, the reformer who was awaited? Would it not simply mean the building up of a new dream? only the eternal struggle of science against the unknown, her searching, pursuing inquiry which incessantly moderated man's thirst for the divine, now seemed to him of import, leaving him waiting to know if she would ever triumph so completely as to suffice mankind by satisfying all its wants. And in the disaster which had overcome his apostolic enthusiasm, in presence of all those ruins, having lost his faith, and even his hope of utilizing old Catholicism for social and moral salvation, there only remained reason that held him up. She had at one moment given way. If he had dreamt that book, and had just passed through that terrible crisis, it was because sentiment had once again overcome reason within him. It was his mother, so to say, who had wept in his heart, who had filled him with an irresistible desire to relieve the wretched and prevent the massacres which seemed near at hand. And his passion for charity had thus swept aside the scruples of his intelligence. But it was his father's voice that he now heard, lofty and bitter reason which, though it had fled, at present came back in all sovereignty. As he had done already after Lourdes, he protested against the glorification of the absurd and the downfall of common sense. Reason alone enabled him to walk erect and firm among the remnants of the old beliefs, even amidst the obscurities and failures of science. Ah, reason, it was through her alone that he suffered, through her alone that he could content himself, and he swore that he would now always seek to satisfy her, even if in doing so he should lose his happiness. At that moment it would have been vain for him to ask what he ought to do. Everything remained in suspense, the world stretched before him still littered with the ruins of the past, of which tomorrow it would perhaps be rid. Yonder, in that dolorous faubourg of Paris, he would find good Abbé Rose, who but a few days previously had written begging him to return and tend, love, and save his poor, since Rome, so dazzling from afar, was dead to charity. And around the good and peaceful old priest he would find the ever-growing flock of wretched ones, the little fledglings who had fallen from their nests, pale with hunger and shivering with cold, the households of abominable misery in which the father drank and the mother became a prostitute, while the sons and the daughters sank into vice and crime. The dwellings, too, through which famine swept, where all was filth and shameful promiscuity, where there was neither furniture nor linen, nothing but purely animal life. And then there would also come the cold blasts of winter, the disasters of slack times, the hurricanes of consumption carrying off the weak, whilst the strong clenched their fists and dreamt of vengeance. One evening, too, perhaps he might again enter some room of horror and find that another mother had killed herself and her 5 little ones, her last born in her arms clinging to her drained breast, and the others scattered over the bare tiles, at last contented, feeling hunger no more now that they were dead. But no, such awful things were no longer possible. Such black misery conducting to suicide in the heart of that great city of Paris, which is brimful of wealth, intoxicated with enjoyment, and flings millions out of window for mere pleasure. The very foundations of the social edifice were rotten. All would soon collapse amidst mire and blood. Never before had Pierre so acutely realized the derisive futility of charity, and all at once he became conscious that the long-awaited word, the word which was at last springing from the great silent multitude, the crushed and gagged people, was justice. Aye, justice, not charity. Charity had only served to perpetuate misery. Justice perhaps would cure it. It was for justice that the wretched hungered. An act of justice alone could sweep away the olden world so that the new one might be reared. After all, the great silent multitude would belong neither to Vatican nor to Quirinal, neither to Pope nor to King. If it had covertly growled through the ages in its long, sometimes mysterious, and sometimes open contest, if it had struggled betwixt pontiff and emperor, who each had wished to retain it for himself alone, it had only done so in order that it might free itself, proclaim its resolve to belong to none on the day when it should cry justice. Would tomorrow then at last prove that day of justice and truth? For his part, Pierre, amidst his anguish, having on one hand that need of the divine which tortures man, and on the other sovereignty of reason which enables man to remain erect, was only sure of one thing, that he would keep his vows, continue a priest, watching over the belief of others though he could not himself believe, and would thus chastely and honestly follow his profession, amidst haughty sadness at having been unable to renounce his intelligence in the same way as he had renounced his flesh and his dream of saving the nations. And again, as after Lourdes, he would wait. So deeply was he plunged in reflection at that window, face to face with the mist which seemed to be destroying the dark edifices of Rome, that he did not hear himself called. At last, however, he felt a tap on the shoulder. "Monsieur l'Abbé!" And then as he turned he saw Victorine, who said to him, "It is 9:30. The cab is there. Giacomo has already taken your luggage down. You must come away, Monsieur l'Abbé." Then seeing him blink, still dazed as it were, she smiled and added, "You were bidding Rome good-bye. What a frightful sky there is." "Yes, frightful," was his reply. Then they descended the stairs. He had handed her 100-franc note to be shared between herself and the other servants, and she apologized for going down before him with the lamp, explaining that the old palace was so dark that evening one could scarcely see. Ah, that departure, that last descent through the black and empty mansion, it quite upset Pierre's heart. He gave his room that glance of farewell which always saddened him, even when he was leaving a spot where he had suffered. Then, on passing Don Vigilio's chamber, whence there came only a quivering silence, he pictured the secretary with his head buried in his pillows, holding his breath for fear lest he should speak and attract vengeance. But it was in particular on the second and first floor landings, on passing the closed doors of Donna Serafina and the Cardinal, that Pierre quivered with apprehension at hearing nothing but the silence of the grave. And as he followed Victorine, who, lamp in hand, was still descending, he thought of the brother and sister who were left alone in the ruined palace, last relics of a world which had half passed away. All hope of life had departed with Benedetta and Dario. No resurrection could come from that old maid and that priest who was bound to chastity. Ah, those interminable and lugubrious passages, that frigid and gigantic staircase which seemed to descend into nihility, those huge halls with cracking walls where all was wretchedness and abandonment. And that inner court, looking like a cemetery with its weeds and its damp porticus, where remnants of Apollos and Venuses were rotting. And the little deserted garden, fragrant with ripe oranges, whither nobody now would ever stray, where none would ever meet that adorable Contessina under the laurels near the sarcophagus. All was now annihilated in abominable mourning, in a death-like silence, amidst which the two last Boccaneras must wait, in savage grandeur, till their palace should fall about their heads. Pierre could only just detect a faint sound, the gnawing of a mouse perhaps, unless it were caused by Abbe Paparelli attacking the walls of some out-of-the-way rooms, preying on the old edifice down below, so as to hasten its fall. The cab stood at the door, already laden with the luggage, the box beside the driver, the valise on the seat, and the priest at once got in. "Oh, you have plenty of time," said Victorine, who had remained on the foot pavement. "Nothing has been forgotten. I'm glad to see you go off comfortably." And indeed, at that last moment Pierre was comforted by the presence of that worthy woman, his compatriot, who had greeted him on his arrival and now attended his departure. "I won't say till we meet again, Monsieur l'Abbé," she exclaimed, "for I don't fancy that you'll soon be back in this horrid city. Good-bye, Monsieur l'Abbé. Good-bye, Victorine, and thank you with all my heart." The cab was already going off at a fast trot, turning into the narrow sinuous streets which lead to the Corso Vittorio Emanuele. It was not raining, and so the hood had not been raised, but although the damp atmosphere was comparatively mild, Pierre at once felt a chill. However, he was unwilling to stop the driver, a silent fellow whose only desire seemingly was to get rid of his fare as soon as possible. When the cab came out into the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, the young man was astonished to find it already quite deserted, the houses shut, the footways bare, and the electric lamps burning all alone in melancholy solitude. In truth, however, the temperature was far from warm, and the fog seemed to be increasing, hiding the house-fronts more and more. When Pierre passed the Cancelleria, that stern colossal pile seemed to him to be receding, fading away, and farther on, upon the right, at the end of the Via di Araceli, starred by a few smoky gas lamps, the Capitol had quite vanished in the gloom. Then the thoroughfare narrowed, and the cab went on between the dark heavy masses of the Gesù and the Altieri Palace. And there in that contracted passage, where even on fine sunny days one found all the dampness of old times, the quivering priest yielded to a fresh train of thought. It was an idea which had sometimes made him feel anxious, the idea that mankind, starting from over yonder in Asia, had always marched onward with the sun. An east wind had always carried the human seed for future harvests towards the west. And for a long while now the cradle of humanity had been stricken with destruction and death, as if indeed the nations could only advance by stages, leaving exhausted soil, ruined cities, and degenerate populations behind, as they marched from Orient to Occident, towards their unknown goal. Nineveh and Babylon on the banks of the Euphrates, Thebes and Memphis on the banks of the Nile, had been reduced to dust, sinking from old age and weariness into a deadly numbness beyond possibility of awakening. Then decrepitude had spread to the shores of the great Mediterranean lake, burying both Tyre and Sidon with dust, and afterwards striking Carthage with senility whilst it yet seemed in full splendour. In this wise, as mankind marched on, carried by the hidden forces of civilization from east to west, it marked each day's journey with ruins. And how frightful was the sterility nowadays displayed by the cradle of history, that Asia and that Egypt, which had once more lapsed into childhood, immobilized in ignorance and degeneracy amidst the ruins of ancient cities that once had been queens of the world. It was thus Pierre reflected as the cab rolled on. Still he was not unconscious of his surroundings. As he passed the Palazzo di Venezia, it seemed to him to be crumbling beneath some assault of the invisible, for the mist had already swept away its battlements, and the lofty, bare, fearsome walls looked as if they were staggering from the onslaught of the growing darkness. And after passing the deep gap of the Corso, which was also deserted amidst the pallid radiance of its electric lights, the Palazzo Torlonia appeared on the right hand, with one wing ripped open by the picks of demolishers, whilst on the left, farther up, the Palazzo Colonna showed its long, mournful façade and closed windows, as if, now that it was deserted by its masters and void of its ancient pomp, it awaited the demolishers in its turn. Then, as the cab at a slower pace began to climb the ascent of the Via Nazionale, Pierre's reverie continued. Was not Rome also stricken? Had not the hour come for her to disappear amidst that destruction which the nations on the march invariably left behind them? Greece, Athens, and Sparta slumbered beneath their glorious memories, and were of no account in the world of today. Moreover, the growing paralysis had already invaded the lower portion of the Italic peninsula, and after Naples certainly came the turn of Rome. She was on the very margin of the death spot which ever extends over the old continent, that margin where agony begins, where the impoverished soil will no longer nourish and support cities, where men themselves seem stricken with old age as soon as they are born. For 2 centuries Rome had been declining, withdrawing little by little from modern life, having neither manufactures nor trade, and being incapable even of science, literature, or art. And in Pierre's thoughts it was no longer St. Peter's only that fell, but all Rome, basilicas, palaces, and entire districts, which collapsed amidst a supreme rending and covered the 7 hills with a chaos of ruins. Like Nineveh and Babylon, like Thebes and Memphis, Rome became but a plain, bossy with remnants, amidst which one vainly sought to identify the sites of ancient edifices, whilst its sole denizens were coiling serpents and bands of rats. The cab turned, and on the right, in a huge gap of darkness, Pierre recognized Trajan's column, but it was no longer gilded by the sun as when he had first seen it. It now rose up blackly like the dead trunk of a giant tree whose branches have fallen from old age. And farther on, when he raised his eyes while crossing the little triangular piazza, and perceived a real tree against the leaden sky, that parasol pine of the Villa Aldobrandini which rises there like a symbol of Rome's grace and pride, it seemed to him but a smudge, a little cloud of soot ascending from the downfall of the whole city. With the anxious fraternal turn of his feelings, fear was coming over him as he reached the end of his tragic dream. When the numbness which spreads across the aged world should have passed Rome, when Lombardy should have yielded to it, and Genoa, Turin, and Milan should have fallen asleep as Venice has fallen already, then would come the turn of France. The Alps would be crossed, Marseille, like Tyre and Sidon, would see its port choked up by sand, Lyons would sink into desolation and slumber, and at last Paris, invaded by the invincible torpor and transformed into a sterile waste of stones bristling with nettles, would join Rome and Nineveh and Babylon in death, whilst the nations continued their march from Orient to Occident following the sun. A great cry sped through the gloom, the death cry of the Latin races. History, which seemed to have been born in the basin of the Mediterranean, was being transported elsewhere, and the ocean had now become the centre of the world. How many hours of the human day had gone by? Had mankind, starting from its cradle over yonder at daybreak, strewing its road with ruins from stage to stage, now accomplished 1/2 of its day and reached the dazzling hour of noon? If so, then the other half of the day allotted to it was beginning. The new world was following the old one, the new world of those American cities where democracy was forming and the religion of tomorrow was sprouting, those sovereign queens of the coming century, with yonder, across another ocean, on the other side of the globe, that motionless Far East, mysterious China and Japan, and all the threatening swarm of the yellow races. However, while the cab climbed higher and higher up the Via Nazionale, Pierre felt his nightmare dissipating. There was here a lighter atmosphere, and he came back into a renewal of hope and courage. Yet the Banca d'Italia, with its brand-new ugliness, its chalky hugeness, looked to him like a phantom in a shroud, whilst above a dim expanse of gardens the Quirinal formed but a black streak barring the heavens. However, the street ever ascended and broadened, and on the summit of the Viminal, on the Piazza delle Terme, when he passed the ruins of Diocletian's baths, he could breathe as his lungs listed. No, the human day could not finish, it was eternal, and the stages of civilization would follow and follow without end. What mattered that eastern wind which carried the nations towards the west, as if borne on by the power of the sun? If necessary, they would return across the other side of the globe, they would again and again make the circuit of the earth, until the day should come when they could establish themselves in peace, truth, and justice. After the next civilization on the shores of the Atlantic, which would become the world's centre, skirted by queenly cities, there would spring up yet another civilization, having the Pacific for its centre, with seaport capitals that could not be yet foreseen, whose germs yet slumbered on unknown shores. And in like way there would be still other civilizations and still others. And at that last moment, the inspiriting thought came to Pierre that the great movement of the nations was the instinct, the need which impelled them to return to unity. Originating in one sole family, afterwards parted and dispersed in tribes, thrown into collision by fratricidal hatred, their tendency was none the less to become one sole family again. The provinces united in nations, the nations would unite in races, and the races would end by uniting in one immortal mankind at last without frontiers, or possibility of wars, mankind living by just labour, amidst an universal commonwealth. Was not this indeed the evolution, the object of the labour progressing everywhere, the finish reserved to history? Might Italy then become a strong and healthy nation, might concord be established between her and France, and might that fraternity of the Latin races become the beginning of universal fraternity? Ah, that one fatherland, the whole earth pacified and happy, in how many centuries would that come? And what a dream! Then, on reaching the station, the scramble prevented Pierre from thinking any further. He had to take his ticket and register his luggage, and afterwards he at once climbed into the train. At dawn on the next day but one, he would be back in Paris. End of section 32. End of Rome by Émile ZOLA. Translated by Ernest VIZETELLY.